I'd like to introduce Nils Lundquist, who's one of our senior consultants at Bitovi. Over the last 10 years, he's worked in a variety of roles across the back end and front end of large web apps. Nils knows that managing a user's session lifecycle can be complicated. It takes a lot of consideration to get right. So today, he's going to introduce us to a new Can Connect behavior that simplifies session management for CanGS apps.
Thanks, Jason. So this is my presentation on how you can use Can Connect to manage user sessions. Specifically, we'll review how a new Can session behavior helps simplify things. To start off with, we'll need to answer the basics. What is a session? This might be familiar, but we'll cover it anyways. A session is a period of access granted to your user when they identify themselves. And browsers pass a token to identify or to indicate the request takes place during the session. So for those web apps, tokens are typically in browser cookies, since this provides a little bit of extra security. And the core of these points is really that sessions are how the backend knows if a request comes from a particular user. Now that we have that out of the way, we'll clarify my keywords not switching over these, so I have to click. What's the life cycle of a session? What do you do with one? So there's several actions that are common to all sessions. That's things like checking if a session is active, logging in to start a new session, and using the metadata of an active session. Often these are things like if the user is logged in and what user that is, what sort of requests a user is permitted to make, and how long until the user must log in again. A lot of applications have kind of auto logout features. So you may be able to guess the last point here, which is logging out of a session. And now that we have like the life cycle out of the way, we can talk about how Can Connect and the new Can session behavior helps simplify this. So like any usage of Can Connect, we build a connection object that handles all of our communication with a particular service. In this case, it communicates with the service that manages sessions. And we'll talk about what that service looks like in the next slide. But as an example of the things that this connection object provides, it provides straightforward methods to do a login and a logout. They return promises, and after successful requests, they update the state of our next point, which is app-wide access to the metadata of the session. That metadata is likely used in multiple components to reference either those permissions or what users logged in. And that connection object actually holds a reference to the active session, so that's easily accessible throughout the app. The next thing that Can session helps with is checking if there is an ongoing session. If the app hasn't already confirmed that there's an active session, wherever the code tries to access the session, it's going to trigger a request to see if the session is active. Even if multiple parts of the code depend on the session, are checking to see if there is an active one, Can session will make it so that only a single request is made to confirm that there is an active session. This is typically done when your application starts up. So let's take a quick look at what requests to a session service might look like. Of course, what I'm going to show here is hypothetical. Your session services might not look exactly like what I show here. That's fine. Can session can be configured to work with most any collection of endpoints. You'll likely have equivalents to the three following requests, which are a request to see if the session is active. In this case, you're going to make a get request to /session. You're going to probably have a request to start a new session, in this case, a post request to /session. And finally, you'll have the delete request to end the session, probably to, or again, to /session. So with these three requests in mind, let's take a look at how to configure a connection using Can session. So here we're defining a type that represents the active session, and we're integrating it with the connection that communicates with the backend service. The important parts to note here are the array of behaviors and the options object that's passed as the second argument to reduce. So these behaviors are the building blocks of a Can Connect connection. The base behavior takes the connection options object as an argument and returns a basic connection. The rest of the behaviors take a connection as their argument, add their functionality to it, and return a connection. So the reduce function is just applying these behavior functions in order, starting with the base on top of the options. And For more details on how this works, you can refer to the Can Connect configuration guide that I link at the end of the presentation. But we're going to focus more on the options object, and that provides the configuration that the session behavior needs to run. The can session behavior needs a reference to the session type, and it's going to add a couple additional methods to that, or actually properties to that. It's also going to need the URLs that we're going to call. So those URLs that we discussed on the previous slide. Get data is the URL that's called when we're checking to see if there's an active session. Create data is the URL that's called when we create a new session, when we log in. And destroy data is the URL that's called when we log out. Connection.init has to be called just to finish setting up the connection after we've created it using reduce. And now that we have this session object, we can look at actually how to use, or the session object and the connection created with it, we can look at how to actually use that. So one of the more important things is depending on an active session and how do your components depend on it, whether it's for waiting until your session is active so that you can make some requests, or whether you're going to use the metadata that comes from having an active session. There's a number of ways of doing this, and in this guide, we're just going to review kind of this most straightforward way, which is waiting for a promise to resolve in your view model. This is a component that displays a list of to-do items loaded from a to-do service using that get list function, but to-dos can't be loaded until you have an active user session. So this component first accesses the current promise property of the session object. This property is added to session by the can session behavior that we set up on the previous slide. And like I mentioned earlier, the session behavior makes a request to see if the session is active the first time the session is accessed. So when current promise is accessed for the first time, that request occurs. If the session is active, that request to check will succeed. It's going to resolve the promise. And to-do.getList is executed, making a request to get the to-dos, setting them up on the view model. After that successful session request, current promise is now resolved, and any component that references it can proceed making the requests or using the session metadata. So there's only that one request, no matter how many components are depending on that. If current promise is unsuccessful, it's a sign that it'll be rejected, the current promise. And this is a sign that you need to log in and start a new session. So this is an excerpt of component code that's responsible for displaying a login form when there isn't an active session. It keeps a reference to the session object as part of its view model so that its template can access current promise and see if it's rejected. If it's rejected, it'll show the login form and allow a session to be started by logging in. So that login form will take information like an email and a password, and when that's submitted, it'll call a method that uses that input to log in. So logging in involves creating a new session object with the properties that should be sent to the backend, calling save on that session instance, makes a post request, and if it succeeds, the session.currentPromise is set to a resolved promise. All the requests that have been waiting for an active session by using current promise can then proceed. Metadata is available from current promise and on another property that we discuss in a moment. So let's talk about that last activity, which is logging out, ending a session. This is another excerpt of that same to-do logging component, but here it's showing a logout button when there is an active session. When the button is clicked, it calls a method on the component view model, and that's the destroy method of the current instance of the session. So session.current is a shortcut to the active session instance. Like current promise, it's set when an active session begins, like current promise, when current promise resolves, the session.current is set when an active session begins and set to null when a session ends. So it's kind of the same cases as current promise when it succeeds, when it rejects. Also, like current promise, the first time it's accessed, if there's no active session, it'll make a request for one. But again, like current promise, no matter how many times you access current and current promise, it's going to deduplicate it. You're only going to get one request. So when destroy is called, it actually makes that destroy request to the session endpoint, whatever you've configured. And if it succeeds, it's going to set current promise to a rejected promise. So any view model properties that are using current promise are going to update because current promise has changed, and they're going to notice it's now a rejected promise, and their state's going to revert to when there was no active session. With that, we've covered the fundamentals of this new CanConnect behavior. And if you're interested in learning more about session management with CanConnect, I have a few resources for you. There's this CanConnect configuration guide if you're interested in seeing just how setting up connections work in general with CanConnect. There is the Can session guide for those who want to dig into this behavior in greater detail. There's a lot we didn't cover in this presentation. And there's the Can session example app for those that want to dive into a practical example. And you can always contact me on the Bitovi community Slack if you have any questions or comments. Thanks. That's all I got.
That was great. Thank you, Nils.
No problem.
We can take questions right now if anyone has any.
I have a comment. Nils alluded to it but didn't show it, which is now CanConnect. There's kind of a before. There's what is it called? Before Ajax or before what is it called?
So before Ajax, yeah, that's covered in the session guide in more detail.
Yeah, but basically there was a lot of people wanted to be able to get the current, like if you have a session, they want it, there's sometimes a token or something you need to include on every single outgoing request as a header or something else. And now there's a before session hook on connections that essentially before Ajax hook that you can essentially, you get the underlying XHR object that it's going to use to make the request, and then you can set any headers or do anything that you want there. So in the guide, it shows how you can listen to, essentially, before any request goes out to like make a new to-do or get all to-dos or whatever, you can make sure you include something from your JSON web token or whatever off of the session pretty easily now.
Yeah. It's like a bit of a specialized case, but there's definitely cases where you got to do that. It's still a good idea to use cookies if you can, because it's a bit more secure if you've got your cookies set up correctly. So, any other questions?
And you mean HTML only cookies?
Yeah, and there's also a new property as well that makes cookies a little bit more secure, like a same origin, I believe, flag you can set.
Yeah, so if anybody's ever seen Bitsentive's code, it essentially now anybody who's using CanJS can do the same thing Bitsentive was doing, which is essentially like you can just kind of like fire and forget creating a session and deleting a session and then inspecting the session. Those things can all work independently compared to something more like Bitballs, where like the session has to be passed from the high level component, the app component, all the way down to everything, and it has to coordinate all that. Instead, this mix-in just allows you to, fire and forget.
Yeah, it really simplifies the process of like initializing your app and having all these components waiting for the session.